You know that moment when you walk into a room and something inside you quietly tightens, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything is just sitting there. The cup you meant to wash, the clothes that somehow became part of the furniture, the small pile on the table that hasn't moved in days. And you notice it. You always notice it. But instead of doing something about it, your body does something else. It pauses, then drifts, then gently looks away. And from the outside, it can look like laziness, like carelessness, like a lack of discipline. That's the story people tend to tell, that if someone doesn't clean their space, it must mean they don't value it, or themselves. But that explanation has always been a little too simple. Because for some people, this isn't about effort. It's about something much quieter, much more internal. The psychology of people who don't clean their house is rarely what it looks like on the surface. And once you start to see it clearly, it stops feeling like a flaw and starts feeling like a pattern that actually makes a strange kind of sense. There's more going on here than most people realize. When psychologists study behavior that seems avoidant or inconsistent, they often don't start with the action. They start with the nervous system. Because before something becomes a habit, it's a response. There's a concept in neuroscience sometimes referred to as task initiation resistance. It sounds technical, but it describes something very human. The gap between knowing something needs to be done and actually beginning it. For some people, that gap is small. For others, it feels almost physical, like trying to push through invisible friction. And what's interesting is that this friction isn't always about the task itself. It's about what the task represents internally. Cleaning, for example, is rarely just cleaning. It's decision-making, it's energy, it's emotional engagement with your environment. And if your system is already overwhelmed, even slightly, your brain doesn't always interpret cleaning as a neutral activity. It interprets it as one more demand, one more thing pulling on already limited resources. So instead of moving toward it, your system does something protective. It delays, not because it doesn't matter, but because, in that moment, it feels like too much. There's also something else happening underneath this that people don't often talk about. Clutter can become emotionally neutral, or even safe. That might sound strange at first, but think about it. A messy space doesn't ask anything from you. It doesn't expect perfection. It doesn't require maintenance in the same immediate visible way that a clean space does. In some cases, it becomes a kind of background noise your mind learns to ignore. And once something becomes background, it stops triggering urgency. Research in behavioral psychology shows that the brain adapts quickly to repeated environments. What once stood out fades. So the pile that bothered you on day 1 becomes invisible by day 5, not because you don't see it, but because your brain has learned it doesn't need to react to it. And that adaptation isn't a failure. It's efficiency, but it can also create a quiet loop where nothing feels urgent enough to change, and over time, that loop becomes a pattern, a rhythm. There's also the emotional layer, because for many people, cleaning isn't just physical effort, it's emotional exposure. Every object holds a small decision. Where does this go? Do I still need this? Why is this even here? And those tiny decisions add up, especially if your mind tends to overprocess or replay the past more than most. Suddenly, cleaning isn't simple anymore. It becomes a series of small confrontations with time, with memory, with yourself. And if you've spent years navigating environments where energy had to be conserved, where rest didn't always feel safe, where your system learned to prioritize survival over order, then it makes sense that something like cleaning doesn't come easily. Because your brain wasn't wired for optimization, it was wired for protection. This is where development matters. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, accumulated way. The environments you grow up in shape how your nervous system responds to effort. If things were unpredictable, if you had to adapt constantly, your brain learns flexibility, not structure. It learns how to manage uncertainty, not how to maintain order. And that doesn't disappear just because your environment changes later. The body keeps those patterns, even when they're no longer necessary. So what looks like avoidance is often just adaptation continuing longer than it needs to. And it's important to say this clearly. This way of being isn't better, and it isn't worse. There are people who clean consistently because it regulates them, because order gives them a sense of control, because structure feels calming, and there are people who move through their environment more fluidly, who prioritize internal states over external ones. Neither is more correct. They're just different expressions of how people manage energy, attention, and emotion. The problem only starts when one is labeled as the standard and the other as a failure. Because that's when shame enters the picture. And shame doesn't create change. It creates resistance. What's more interesting is the paradox hidden inside this pattern. Because the same mind that struggles to clean is often deeply perceptive, highly aware, capable of noticing subtle emotional shifts, complex patterns, things other people overlook. That kind of awareness comes with a cost. Your attention is constantly being pulled inward, or toward meaning, which means less energy is available for repetitive, low-stimulation tasks, like organizing, like tidying. So it's not that the capacity isn't there, it's that the system prioritizes differently, and over time those priorities shape behavior. There's also a quiet trade-off. A space that isn't perfectly maintained can feel more forgiving, less rigid, less demanding. For some people, that creates room to think, to feel, to exist without pressure. But it can also create a subtle weight, a background awareness that something is unfinished, that something is waiting. And holding both of those truths at once is part of the experience. This is where things become more personal, because if you've ever found yourself in that space, not cleaning, not because you don't care, but because something inside you just doesn't move, then you've probably also felt the quiet self-judgment that comes with it, that internal voice that says you should be different, more disciplined, more consistent, more functional. But when you look at it through this lens, it stops being about what you're failing to do and starts being about what your system has learned to protect: energy, attention, emotional stability. And when you understand that, the feeling shifts. Slightly. It becomes less about forcing change and more about recognizing the pattern without turning it into a flaw. Because you're not broken, you're patterned. And patterns can be understood. They can be adjusted. But they don't need to be judged. There's a difference between awareness and pressure. One creates space, the other creates resistance. And if something in this feels familiar, if you've recognized yourself somewhere in this quiet dynamic, then there's probably more beneath it, more patterns, more adaptations, more ways your mind has learned to navigate the world that don't always match what people expect, but still make sense when you look closely enough. And once you start seeing those patterns, you don't really unsee them. You just begin to understand yourself in a way that feels a little less heavy, a little more honest. And if that feeling stays with you, there's more of this to explore.